Welcome to Complicating the Narrative, a podcast that takes on the challenging questions in public health by embracing complexity rather than avoiding it. I'm your host, Salma Abdullah. Sea level rise has been talked about for decades, but mostly as a climate problem, an engineering problem, and a problem for the future. It has rarely been framed as a public health problem. That is despite the fact that up to 410 million people are projected to live on land below the high tide threshold by the end of this century. In 14 Pacific Island countries, 62% of health infrastructure already sits within 500 meters of the coast. And the people losing their homes, their lands, and their drinking water are largely the people who did the least to cause the crisis they're living through. In April this year, the Lancet launched its Commission on Sea Level Rise, Health, and Justice, the first major efforts to examine the rising seas through a public health lens. Today, I'm joined by two of the Commission's leaders. Dr. Kathryn Bowen is co-chair of the Commission, Professor of Environment, Climate, and Global Health at the University of Melbourne, and Deputy Director of the Melbourne Climate Futures. She has been a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report and advises governments and multilateral agencies across the Indo-Pacific on climate and health. Dr. Jemilah Mahmood is a commissioner, executive director of the Sunni Center for Planetary Health in Malaysia, and a physician whose career has spanned clinical medicine, frontline humanitarian responses, government advisory work, and leadership at multiple international organizations. Together, they bring the science and policy lens that this conversation needs. Jemilah, Kathryn, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Lovely to be here. Thanks, Salma.
So I want to start first just setting the level and expectations for our audience. Our audience is mostly people who are interested in public health, in medicine. So they might be wondering, why do we care about rising sea levels as a health, a justice problem? Why do we have a Lancet Commission for that issue? Kathryn, let's start with you.
It's an interesting question because we've often referred to sea level rise as a slow-moving hazard, I suppose. Climate hazard is the language that we use in the climate science field. But that's actually not entirely correct because we're already seeing fast onset impacts from sea level rise. So, for example, sea level rise changes the way communities by the coast experience inundation of the water into their agricultural produce and increasing salinity into the water supply. And just by looking at those two examples, food and water, that immediately makes it become a health issue because food and water security really are two of the most foundational, essential elements that we need as humans to survive on this planet. We are understanding that although sea level rise is happening at the moment, slowly in terms of the oceans level rising, the impacts are now. They're immediate, and we're seeing changes in the way that extreme weather events like storm surges impact coastal communities in particular. And I know we'll get into more detail in terms of the specific health impacts, but yeah, it's absolutely framed as a health concern. And the other reason is that health ministers have raised this as one of their most important issues that they agree needs to be dealt with in a much more serious way. So, for example, a couple of years ago in 2024, the group of Western Pacific health ministers called for urgent global attention and improved governance and accelerated action to protect populations from the health consequences of sea level rise. So from that political perspective too, there's a push for us to be much better prepared, understand what the risks are to health, and fundamentally support communities and populations in these at-risk areas.
So Jemilah, if we can just piggyback on that, can you tell us why do you think the time is right now for a Lancet Commission? Why would a Lancet Commission be important in moving the needle on this conversation?
Thank you. I think Kathryn just painted to us a very clear picture on the importance of sea level rise. For me, the sea level rise issue has been treated over the last 30 years as a coastal problem, a coastline problem, and a future problem. Yet it's here, actually. It's neither a coastal nor a future problem. It's a present-day public health emergency, and it's the mother of all injustices, if you like. Because the people losing their homes, their burial grounds, their drinking water, the people who did almost nothing to cause sea level rise. And I think this is why we have to take this very seriously, because 80% of the determinants of health are outside the health sector. And until we fix those, we won't really be having, good health and well-being for people. So why this commission, I feel, is very important. It's the first of such commissions that looks at rising seas through a health and a justice lens. And to ask the harder questions existing institutions don't ask: who is accountable and what do we owe? So I'm delighted to be on this commission together with Kathryn and Christiana Figueres and so many others who are not just scientists and practitioners of law and justice, but also people who actually live on coastlines, who are living in countries where the reality of the sea level rise is threatening its own citizens and also its neighboring countries. So I feel that the time is absolutely right, because 410 million people who are projected to live on land will live below high tide levels by 2100 in 14 Pacific countries. 62% of health infrastructure sits within 500 meters of the coast. And I think we heard this very, very clearly from the regional director of WHO Western Pacific. I'm a Malaysian. I live on a peninsula, so the sea is around me. And I have seen with my own eyes how sea level rise has affected people who are living on coastlines, how the health patterns for them have also changed, the anxiety and fear that many who live in coastal communities actually experience. And until you actually felt that raw fear, it's very hard for many people to think about sea level rise as a health emergency, but it is. And as mentioned by Kathryn earlier, the UN General Assembly in 2024, there was a high-level meeting on sea level rise, and low-lying states characterized this as a global crisis threatening 1 billion people. And Samoa's then PM, he had said, we contributed almost nothing to the global scourge, but it is our land that is being consumed by the sea. So there's no better time than now to start addressing the impact of sea level rise on people's health, justice, and equity.
So the number 410 million, I read it. It was really striking to me when I read through all of the work that you were doing. And I actually wrote it in my notes because that's a big number. I think it feels a bit abstract to people when they think about 2100. They think that's a long time away from now. So if we want to ground the health impact of rising sea levels right now for people who are directly affected, I've been to Malaysia, beautiful country, as you said, Jemilah. But as you said, also you were surrounded by water all around you. So people in those places that are affected by the rising sea levels, what are the health impacts they will be facing today?
I think that the medical or health problems that people who are facing sea level rise, the range of that is very, very broad. First of all, there is a direct impact of sea level rise on people's homes and livelihoods. So there will be a very serious pressure on income generation, which then has a vicious circle. If you have low income, you become poorer, your nutritional status drops, your everything else will fail accordingly. But the more direct thing, of course, is that people now have to experience sea level rise doesn't happen on its own. Often it also is accompanied by heat, might be accompanied also by storms and surges. So there could be saltwater intrusion into lands that then affect also agriculture. And also salt levels will actually rise, drinking salt levels, water salt levels, because salt can intrude into water systems as well. So in those cases, we have seen rising cases of high blood pressure, particularly around pregnant women, which is very, very worrying. And I'm an obstetrician and gynecologist, so obviously I worry about this a lot. And writ large, this saltwater rise causes also damaged crops, also the need to look at alternative forms of agriculture and income. Sea level rise also, with saltwater intrusion particularly, it really affects everything else around you. Homes may be taken away with sea level rise, and therefore that creates exposure, a lot of other issues that will be related to then that as well. And I think we've got to look also at other things like mental health problems. For many of the people in the Pacific, ancestral land is sacred. And when sea level rise takes away the last resting places of people you love, then that obviously is going to create serious anxiety, mental health problems, of course, ranging from depression to other illnesses. And in places often where in the first place mental health issues were not prevalent, where expertise were probably not even there, the access to health may also be limited. So it's a systems problem. It's not just a one health problem. It's how it impacts people's lives and livelihoods, how it impacts people's own culture and values, and on the physical side, how it actually causes issues with increased salt intrusion and potentially also direct injury due to sea level rise with drowning and so forth.
And I think also something that you highlighted earlier, where 62%, I think, of hospitals, you said, are closer to 200 meters of the coast, which means might be directly impacted once the sea level rise continues. So this is the picture. This is why it's important to think about rising sea levels as a health. And I really like adding the justice problem component to it, because as we mentioned, people who are mostly affected by it are people who have not contributed to why we're seeing the rising sea levels. Kathryn, you framed the entire commission around three concepts. Justice, we spoke about a bit, but you also have two other components that I'm really interested in, which are connection and imagination. Can you tell us a bit more about each one of those? I'm particularly interested in imagination. I'm going to come back to it. I'm actually wondering, how did you let you add imagination to a Lancet Commission? You don't see that a lot in Lancet Commissions, the word imagination.
Well, this is what happens when you gather people together that are really passionate about how do we solve this. We know that we've got all the technological answers. We've got a lot of the finance, really. It exists globally. It's just not focusing in on the right areas. And so what is it? What is that missing part of the recipe that would then propel some really fantastic solutions? And our first gathering of commissioners last year, when we started discussing the approach and co-designing how this commission would look, it was very, very clear that we had to think differently. So yes, imagination and creativity are core to the work that the commission will do. And imagination really is going to, using our imagination really will help us to think beyond the policy frames that maybe inhibit us at the moment, like the current policy framing and the scientific framing. And we know that policymakers and politicians are most of the time the individuals in our communities that we need to be convincing with really clear stories and narratives. So that narrative and that storyline will be an integral part of the imagination and creativity element that is one of those three really critical parts of the commission. So we will be looking to communities for them to share their stories with us in a very respectful way. This might be through storytelling or dance or theatre or art. It's such an emotional topic, this one. As Jemilah said, it brings in so many deeply, deeply sensitive and powerful themes. So whether that is because communities are losing the graves of their elders that are being washed away, I mean, if we just take a minute to think about the consequences of that on families and intergenerationally, it's just profound. So I think sharing those types of stories, putting to the forefront these community messages and encouraging the people in power. Of course, we all have power to different degrees. But when we're thinking about power in this example, we're also thinking about the power that's vested in our political systems as well. And how do we use the knowledge, the incredible wisdom of the communities we will work with to share these stories of impact in particular? On the flip side of that, this commission is not going to take a deficits-based approach, that's for sure. So we will really be highlighting communities that are showing the ways forward despite all of the turmoil that might be occurring around and within communities. So we don't want to be painting this as that communities have no agency and no autonomy. We've seen incredible stories of strength in communities over millennia that have dealt with so many challenging, complex issues. However, we are at the point where, with this issue in particular, we must act urgently. So hence these three themes that will really drive the work of the Commission. And the second one that you pointed to as well was connection. And it's all related. I mean, I think that's part of the theme of connection, is that we see that health and our environment, we are one and part of nature, humans. We can't use the phrase humans and nature. That does not make sense. So it's humans as part of nature, as part of our environment. We're inseparable. So it's also taking much more care in terms of how we're framing ourselves as humanity. And also importantly, recognising, as Jemilah touched on as well, that there are distinct ways of knowing and being in the world, our different cultural groups, our different traditional groups, our Indigenous groups. And I think it's just timely for this Commission to take a much broader and inclusive way of understanding the world and human beings' role in it. So with the justice principle as well, it's the combination of those three. This issue is innately unjust. We must be looking at different ways to communicate the impacts of sea level rise, but also, as importantly, the responses and the solutions that can be community driven. We know that we're going to see some alarming statistics coming out of our Commission in terms of the health impacts of sea level rise. The research is accumulating, but it's really in the next year or so that we'll start to see a propulsion of more research looking at the health impacts of sea level rise globally. And that will, I suppose, provide the foundation for these further exploration of those principles of how do we connect with one another in terms of recognising that health, culture and the environment and place are all inseparable? How do we use our imagination and creativity to connect with communities, to share stories, to really cut through to policymakers and politicians who have the ability to make decisions that will matter? Going back to what I was saying earlier around we have the technology, we have the finance, it's just not distributed in a way that's just globally. What we don't have is the political will to act on climate change broadly, and this issue in particular. So I think it's that combination that will be super powerful as part of this Commission.
I think it's so well said by Kathryn, but if I may add to that, I think that the honest framing of reimagining is not utopia. It's actually it's a planning posture. It's accepts three things at once, that some places will be lost, some places may be transformed, and the difference between those two outcomes is largely a question of money, governance, and whose knowledge counts. I think that last bit on whose knowledge counts is quite critical for us at the Commission. And I think that reimagining life with sea level rise across our region, particularly Pacific and Asia, it's not about technology. It's about three shifts: building infrastructure that moves with water rather than against it, redesigning health systems for a coast that no longer holds still, and redesigning and treating frontline communities particularly as the architects of adaptation, not victims. So I think that reimagining, if we don't get our mental shift right, then we'll always be having the victim mentality. And then how do you go into a fight or flight mode of response? So I think that's, for me, is very, very critical. It is already happening in some parts of the world, like in Bangladesh with their floating gardens, Fiji's health facility retrofit program. I mean, there are many things that actually are beginning to show us that they can work. They can be reimagined, and then we don't leave people more vulnerable than they are. Or when they are not, then the gap becomes a rich-poor country gap. And that kind of rich country adaptation and frontline survival, that is widening.
That is really helpful, because I was actually going to ask about existing technologies, what we know about them. And I would love to come back later to the financing question. But before we move to that, and Jemilah, if I can just get back to you on this. So both of you said you're really interested in communities and different types of knowledge and really working with those who were mostly affected by the problem to make sure that you provide recommendations that are practical. You're reimagining the world, not in a utopia level. I really like that framing. The question I have, though, and I struggle with this because community engagement has become slogan that we say everywhere. And I worry about that in public health. And I was wondering, what is the commission doing to ensure that it's not something that we just go to communities, we talk to them, and then we leave? How do you make sure that their work is truly ingrained in the recommendations that you have from the commission? Jemilah?
I really like your question because I have a real issue with the word community engagement, because just saying that already highlights the power imbalance that happens, that we engage with communities. I think in our commission, what's very unique is communities are leading. Among the commission members, we have amazing young, more aged commission members who have lived experiences, who actually have the knowledge and probably the solutions that we need to be better at listening at. So I think this is where this Lancet Commission for me is very unique and really powerful, because it does bring the reality of these lives that are exposed to sea level rise to life. And that communities themselves, as I mentioned, they are the architects of adaptation. It's not for us to tell them what to do. They know what is happening. They can probably guide us and then demand from us some solutions that may require a little more thinking, whether it's in technology, whether it's in science. As a scientist myself, I feel that community level science is so powerful. And we have these commissioners driving us during our meetings and reminding us through very gentle reimagination and storytelling.
Well, I was just going to add to Jemilah's point on our commissioners, and it's just incredible the breadth of our commissioners, and it's a true privilege to be part of the team. That's what we are. We're a team, and particularly Jemilah with her experience, as well as Ofa Kaisami from Tonga. She's told us in very, very clear terms what sea level rise means for her communities in the Pacific region in particular. And we also have Anne Paulina from Australia, from Western Australia, an incredible Indigenous leader who has worked on these issues and many more for many years and seen the impacts in particularly Indigenous communities of a changing environment along the coast as well, where Anne is from, on the coast of Western Australia. So that's just a few examples of the commissioners who really will bring out those incredible perspectives and keep us really focused on community and community solutions. And it's just so fortunate that we have such a wonderful group of commissioners, and that's only a snapshot of the incredible colleagues we have on this.
So that was actually going to be one of my questions. I was part of a PD commission where we had to work with 25 commissioners across different disciplines. It is not an easy task. You have 26 commissioners from across many countries and disciplines ranging from, you said, epidemiology, law, Indigenous science, and economics. And I was actually wondering, as you think about all of those people who are bringing excellent different perspectives, what do you think would be the most productive area of disagreement that you will work on together to try to provide practical recommendations at the end of your work? Hopefully, I'm not trying to get you to tell us where are going to be the recommendations. I know this is something you're going to be working on for a while, but where do you think the area of the most productive tension will be that would be helpful for people when they read the recommendations? Jemilah, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I can start. IPCC gives us the physical science consensus and broad impacts framing. It's structurally cautious, government approved by line, and weak on health and on accountability. So if you look at the IPCC alone, sea level rise will be a core component of the health chapter of AR7. But that chapter is too constrained by the IPCC's role, and they assess and they don't prescribe, right? But the Lancet Countdown then tracks indicators across health and climate annually. So it's good monitoring, but by design, it doesn't propose legal architecture to interrogate power. And the 2025 Countdown report ran to over 50 pages of indicators. That's its job. Now, the Commission does three things those bodies are not built to do. It integrates Indigenous and frontline community knowledge as evidence, not as testimonial color. It examines legal frameworks to hold states and corporations accountable for the health harms of sea level rise, building directly on the ICJ advisory opinion of July 2025. And I think it tackles loss and damage, managed retreat, and statehood without sovereignty and as health and ethics questions, not just diplomatic ones. So why then is it different, and why it's important? How do we then navigate those tensions? I think, first of all, by acknowledging the tensions, acknowledging the differences, because it's very important to know the difference between the Commission and IPCC in the Lancet Countdown. And the other is actually to embrace that tension and to say, okay, now, based on the challenges we face, on the realities that we confront, the legal frameworks that we're working within, how then do we advance what I mentioned are the three things, right? Integrating Indigenous and frontline community knowledge as evidence, examining those legal frameworks that hold states accountable, and then tackle the loss and damage issue. All three are very, very sticky issues. So far, I think we've only had 2 meetings, but every meeting I go to, and I'm speaking from a personal perspective, I come out more humble than I was when I walked into the meeting, because as someone who's been in the frontiers of science, dealing with people, and I've dealt with many people who have been impacted by crisis, I realize how little I know around Indigenous practices and Indigenous wisdom that actually holds many of the solutions that we're looking for. And I think that reigniting of our own imagination as scientists, blending that with an infusion of new knowledge to Indigenous people, brings this wonderful magic formula that we end up talking with each other, not across each other, and recognizing both sides of the room have actually so much to learn. And that is the best trigger for reimagination. So for me, I'm very excited. This is not an easy commission, in my opinion, but you're also having a very unique opportunity to blend knowledge. And maybe, and this is a very personal perspective, so with due respect to my co-chair, maybe it's time for us to make science more relevant to everyday people's lives. Maybe it has to touch hearts, not just touch minds. And we don't have much time with the way the world is going and the planet is spinning a little bit out of control, but we can never underestimate the power of passion and reimagination. And I think this is an important commission to say it's not just another report. It's the Lancet Commission have a track record, right? They have reframed the field, for example, in health and climate change, which we are directly in. The Planetary Health Commission did the same for establishing a new discipline. They don't always translate into policy, but they do shift the language decision makers are forced to use. And I think, this is deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. We're not producing a consensus document that everyone can sign. We are producing one that, if we succeed, will name the actors and gaps that other reports maybe soften. So that's where I see the power of such a wonderful bunch of people who are all experts in their own rights, come together to build something that is better for all.
And I would entirely agree. And just picking up on Jemilah's point around touching the hearts and the minds, I think that's potentially an area where there might be some discomfort, Salma, as you were asking us, what might the areas of, I think it was discomfort that emerged through the commission. And I do think that those of us who are researchers are really quashed most of the time from bringing in our emotions and our activist sides as well. So there's obviously a very firm scientific basis to our commission, but it's in the way that we tell the story along the way. And it's not at the end either. It's through the entire process, how we are engaging with policymakers and politicians through the pathway of preparing the commission report. And so I think that that's potentially an area which will be really intriguing to be observing and part of as well. And as a co-chair, our role is to build those narratives and those different ways of seeing the world into a cohesive structure and into a cohesive story. So I agree with Jemilah that it's a challenging commission. It's really putting researchers on notice in terms of why isn't our research cutting through? We know so much about this issue already. We know so much about the communities and the populations that are at the highest risk. What else do we need to do? So we need to think so differently around this commission. And I've had the privilege to be part of IPCC, the Lancet Countdown, and now this. And I would thoroughly agree with Jemilah. This is the avenue that we can really pose different questions and different solutions. We can really be putting on a much more creative, unbounded proposition, I suppose, or set of suggestions and ways forward. And with the backing of the Lancet, and the Lancet has absolutely put itself out there as a journal that is demanding accountability in terms of climate and health action. It's demanding, transparency around who is making the sorts of decisions that are happening across the globe. And so I think we're in a very good space with this Lancet Commission and the readership of the Lancet, but getting beyond the typical Lancet readership as well, and being able to share this work to audiences that may not already be fully understanding the impacts of sea level rise on human health and how unjust the situation is that we see at the moment. And so that would be an additional point, is how do we make sure that the Commission report and all of the communication that comes through the Commission process gets to different types of audiences as well.
So this is actually quite interesting, because as I researched both of your work, a big question I had was in relation to evidence to action. What does that mean? Both of you have worked on really important commissions, important panels that try to advance what we know to action. And I was wondering, what do you bring from those experiences? And if you can speak a bit about them. I know, Kathryn, you mentioned you were part of the intergovernmental panel on climate change. Jemilah, you've led a lot of work on planetary health, especially coming from, not from the global north, but from the global south. I think we all know that some of the work we do stalls, some of it does not. And I was wondering, what were the lessons that you got from the different parts of the work that you did that showed you what actually works and what stalls, and what are the lessons that you're bringing to this commission? Kathryn?
So reflecting on that question, I think for me, in all of the conversations I have around climate and health, I like to start with understanding where that person sits, if we're talking at an individual level anyway, where that policymaker sits in terms of their understanding of the issue. And so something Jemilah briefly brought up earlier was the importance of listening and the importance of deep listening, because it's not going to work if we come in as these researchers or these IPCC authors or these Lancet authors saying how the world needs to work or how politicians are making all the wrong decisions. So for me, it's really important. And yeah, again, that word humble that Jemilah used earlier, it's really important that we take that position of humility and understand where people fit and where they sit and where they're coming from. To me, that's the most powerful way to change and to influence people's minds and ideas around the world. And it's not in a manipulative way, but it's in an understanding way. It comes from a place of deep humility and understanding that everyone brings different perspectives. We have different reasons for making the decisions we do in our lives. But if we are opening up ourselves to develop a greater sense of empathy, understanding different positions, and we can show that ourselves. And I think that really encourages people we speak to start to behave in that way as well. So I think just allowing that space for that listening, for that sharing of ideas, and meeting that person or that community where they are. And it sounds really simple, but it's actually a very complex process, and it does take time, and it takes trust and the building of partnerships and making sure, just reassuring people or communities that we all want the same thing. Fundamentally, we all want to be living on a healthy, safe, secure planet for ourselves, for our friends, for our families, for our children. We all want the same thing. And so even sometimes to frame it in that way and then work backwards, that's, I think, I've found a really powerful way to shift minds and have people gather together in a more constructive way. I think when it comes to I do a lot of work outside of the health sector because, again, as Jemilah said, the health sector has an important but really only small role to play in all of this. It's those other sectors. It's agriculture, it's water, it's finance, of course. It's women's affairs, urban design, transport. It's all of those sectors that really determine how our health looks today and how it will continue to look and change over time. So I've spent a lot of time speaking with decision makers in those non-health sectors, as we call them, to share the health impacts of climate change that it might arise from their areas and the fact that action in their own sectors will make an enormous difference to all of our human health and well-being. So another message, I suppose, from the health community is for us to be getting out of our health silo and speaking with others that perhaps we're not familiar with just as much. But the health story is a universal story, and it's only by sharing that and really understanding the different perspectives and opening that conversation that we'll see the change that we need to see. And that also applies to politicians. So we know that politicians who've made very strong decisions in my country, for example, on mental health, ministers have had personal and familial experience. And that's what's driven them to make, oftentimes, decisions that have been very strong and bold. So it's that empathy. We can't obviously have every minister have something personal happen to them, although of course it's happening more and more. We are exposed to more floods, more heat waves and so on, and that is becoming a much more personal impact. And so I think it's that combination of empathy, the lived experience, and that deep listening that will really move us to where we need to be.
So, Jemilah, then, where do you think efforts like this, where Kathryn mentioned you're trying to bring different perspectives, you're trying to bring the evidence but the lived experience, where do you think you might hit a wall here? And if I can be also even more bold to ask you, I think the hardest question you're going to face is who pays? Like the people who are most affected are the people who had the least to do with why we're seeing climate change impacts. How are you going to tackle that question?
First of all, I just want to say I totally agree with what Kathryn said. For turning evidence into action, we need we ourselves as scientists, as people who do research and advocate, we have to rewire the way we think as well and put ourselves into the boots or shoes of those who are the most stubborn and who will block us at every way. And I think that your question on who pays, right? And what is it that is, what are the hardest questions in adaptation? And I think some of what sea level rise will force is a genuinely irreducible loss. And we have to be very honest that no adaptation framework dissolves that. The managed retreat is not a technical fix. It's a moral and political process. The single most important question is not whether to retreat, it's who decides on whose land, whose money, whose timeline. And if we get that question wrong, and even a well-funded relocation reproduces injustice at cost, money does not solve everything. Solve some things, but if you don't start looking at it from that perspective of human feelings, human history, human culture, then we might end up with a lot of problems, right? So in terms of payment, we know, and I'm going to talk about it from global, regional, local. We know that global processes have become so complicated, and we're living in a world where geopolitics is really the order of the day. There is no one solution. There's fracture in the global community. The intergovernmental multilateral processes are now losing a lot of trust. And at most times, if I was someone living on a Pacific island looking out to all the rest of the world, I would say, gosh, this is one crazy bunch of people out there who don't really understand what we are going through in our everyday life and everyday realities of life. So that fracture we have to acknowledge. Number two, the whole issue around nationalism, protectionism also is going to limit how much countries actually will bother about others. And I'm being very candid here. We're asking for a loss and damage fund that has not been filled. In fact, it's a comical amount what has been pledged. And this reality almost that it doesn't affect us, so why should we bother? And the reason is that maybe, just maybe, science alone has not been able to shift decisions and ideas. Science alone does not move the money. And it's time for us to open up, to live dangerously, to reimagine how science is going to live in the minds of those who don't think like us. And I think that's where, Kathryn's earlier opening about, bringing in culture and arts and the things that sometimes we are very uncomfortable to do as scientists, not losing the evidence. The second I would say is that don't think too big, go down to local. I think that if we start locally and look for solutions that work, find pockets of the resources that will make it happen, and show some good results. What the world needs a lot more is inspiration and more positive stories. And the doom and gloom scenario of 1.5 or 2 degrees or X centimeter sea level rise sometimes a little bit overwhelming for many people, including decision makers. So I think we've got to, as we do this commission, as we run this commission, one of my big asks will be, how do we also tell the stories that are positive? How do we show people that it can actually be done, right? I think we can look at, there are many real world cases. I'm sure we will surface them in our commission. For example, Fijian Vuni Goloa, government-supported planned village relocation. Then we look at Jean-Charles, for example, in Louisiana, very different worlds, how they've actually looked at it. And how do we learn from those kinds of circumstances of what community, how communities moved decision makers to act differently? And the elephant in the room is political will. And unfortunately, politicians have only 5-year visions to the next election, when finding solutions for sea level rise and injustice require 50-year visions. I think that's the hardest thing to do. How do you unlock that? I'm going to say the ICJ advisory opinion, the courage of young people around the world to stand up and ask for and demand for their rights may be the trigger that starts escalating, hopefully, this domino effect of governments realizing that, hang on a minute, there are people who are upset about this. They want to see change. They're going to demand it, and also be able to show the benefits of that investment. I think tell the story right, show where it is actually in your own political interest, it is in your own national interest and economic interest, development interest, that health is taken very, very seriously. Sea level rise is a real issue that will actually impact not just people's lives, but entire economies, existence even. So I think that we need, what I like about our commission is it's not just scientists. You've got social scientists, historians. You kind of need to have a whole new approach in how you're going to tackle this issue. And I think, the hard questions is like, who decides and who has standing to refuse? What counts as loss? Whose money and on what terms? What about staying in place? How does that cost? So all these very difficult, questions need to be surfaced and put on the table. And everyone needs to be pushed into uncomfortable territory. There's no version of the next several decades in which significant numbers of people don't lose their homes. It's a reality. And if we pretend otherwise, including using soft language like resilience and adaptation, it itself can become a form of harm. The honest position is that some losses are irreducible. Responsibility for them is traceable. And the questions of accountability is political, not technical. So what we can do is to translate when evidence meets a moment, I would say. We've got to have that moment, and to also be able to show what success might look like in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, and what stands between here and there. How do you deal with geopolitical retrenchment? How do you deal with the adaptation finance gap? And how do we actually get out of the narrative trap? So these are some of my ideas. I don't think I have one solution to this, Salma, but these are the uncomfortable questions we need to confront if we are going to get anywhere forward. To be able, the most trusted people in the world are actually health professionals. It's time for health professionals to stand up and call this out. Sorry, I'm very passionate about this because I'm a health professional.
I love it.
Yes.
I love it. And it's interesting that you say this. We just launched a trust survey across 8 countries, and the most trusted group in it, not like, it was still not trusted that much, were scientists and healthcare professionals. So I fully agree with that. Kathryn, anything that you want to add to what Jemilah said, but also I think with the framing as well of like, how do we make the entire world care? So this is rightly focused on Western Pacific countries, but there are places, other low-income countries, if you can think of Alexandria in Egypt, even high-income countries where this is going to be a real issue. Miami here in the United States is being affected, New Orleans. How can we find a framing that highlights the injustices that are affecting Western Pacific countries, but at the same time that gets a lot more buy-in, especially highlighting some of the really interesting points when it comes to political will that Jemilah just talked about?
So The commission is global. It's being supported by a secretariat run out of the Western Pacific region of the WHO, but it's absolutely global, and we have commissioners from Africa, from the Caribbean, and from the Pacific, and from South and Southeast Asia, and from every, it's a very, very representative bunch of incredible commissioners. So I just wanted to note that it is absolutely a global commission. And I do think if we're going to see the change that's needed urgently, as Jemilah said, we can't adapt our way out of this. There are going to be losses and damages that are felt, and the support for those is absolutely insufficient at the moment. The other piece in our armoury is as we've mentioned a little bit, the International Court of Justice, the advisory opinion, and that's set to be tabled at the UN General Assembly in the second half of May. So that's very, very soon. And I am particularly keeping a very, very close eye on that, because if that resolution is passed, states are obligated to act on climate change, then that is going to really open the pathways for much more support, whether it be financial, whether it be political, for the urgent issues that are facing us around climate and other environmental challenges that we're faced with. So I'm particularly keeping a very, very close eye on the process within the General Assembly, because we know that there's been some, attempts to block the resolution from being considered at the General Assembly, and it's really important that states do comply with their obligations to cooperate so that we can effectively protect the environment, the climate system, and fundamentally human rights. So again, coming back to that issue of injustice. And I think the combination of the legal pathways and the human health narratives and storylines is providing us with a very fruitful platform for these discussions. So we have, with a colleague here in Melbourne, we've been supporting some research looking at how human health is being included in litigation cases around climate change. And it is increasing in its presence. More and more we're seeing cases come to courts that are now noting the human health impacts of whether it might be approval for a new mine or other issues. It's really interesting to see how human health is increasing in its profile in litigation. So to me, that's also a really important avenue for that shift. The political will is not going to shift on its own. It needs levers to make these changes. And so I think that that's a really important one that we'll all be keeping a close eye on over the next couple of weeks.
I don't envy either one of you. I think the task you have is a heavy lift. But I'm so glad that you were thinking about the human perspective of it, because I'm from Sudan, and I keep thinking that we had a dam that was built in Sudan about 40, 50 years ago. And the people around it, they were told this is going to happen. This area is going to be, it's not rising sea levels, but it was just people being told to move from the areas they grew up in, their ancestors were in. And most of the people just would not leave, even though they would have floodings every year as the dam opened. So I think it is always like, I'm a scientist. I'm someone who deeply cares about the quantitative aspect of the work that we do. But that was a moment that just like clearly, at least in the history of my country, where people care deeply about the areas they're in. And I think knowing that a lot of people would have to leave the places they live in, that's going to be a hard part of the conversation. That you're including that, I think it is really helpful, because that's the reality of the world. People don't like moving away from the areas of their ancestries. And I'm glad you're thinking about this. Just to conclude, I think I want to pick up on something both of you mentioned earlier, but Jemilah, you mentioned that political cycles work in 5 years, and then this is a 50-year, 100-year problem. And as someone who works in social determinants of health policies, that I see that a lot. But for you, for the commission, it's 2030. What does success look like? When do you say, okay, we've done the work that we think is helpful? Of course, there is a lot more work that needs to be done, but we've done something that we think will change the conversation. So either one of you, if you want to start.
Well, to me, success looks like a rapid deceleration of our greenhouse gas emissions, because fundamentally that is what's driving this incredible, grave issue we're seeing. Every day we're seeing health impacts of climate change in different communities. Wherever I'm working, I grab the local newspaper. It's either on the front page, the second page. There's always an example of an extreme weather event. Could be a flood, could be a drought, could be a heat wave, and I read that and I bring it to the meeting where I'm at, and I have it to talk. We have it to talk to, and it's in front of us. It's happening now. So more sharing of those stories, more helping people understand that it is impacting them now, and it will continue to impact them. And so I think by 2030, we need to see that urgent reversal of our greenhouse gas emissions and very, very ambitious nationally determined contributions to do so, the NDCs that each country report to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But in partnership with that are the adaptation activities. We know that there's a substantial amount of impacts that we cannot reverse at this point. So we need to be in concert with the mitigation aspect, adapting and really forging ahead with the urgency that's needed for adaptation at the same time.
Jemilah, what would success look like for you?
I had to think about this and referred back to previous Lancet commissions that have been more successful than others. And I think we can take good examples like the Lancet Commission, the Climate and Health Commission, and so forth, that have led to actually sustain attention on these areas which are very important, right? So I agree totally with Kathryn. How do we make sure that every politician in this world hopefully understands that sea level rise is not someone else's business. Actually, all of us are going to be impacted. All of us are very connected. And until and unless we reduce emissions, we reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, we stop the glacial melt and, ice melt, we acknowledge there are people who are like us, who want the same things our children want, who are living on those coastal communities, and that we have a role to ensure that their lives don't get worse, but actually improve, with the lived reality that some may be completely displaced from their place of birth and culture. I think that for me, I would like to see a movement growing from this commission to demand states to take action. I'm not less hopeful about global things. I'm more hopeful that people in these communities, people who are not in these communities but feel for these communities through the stories that we tell, through the evidence that we produce, will stand up for these people to demand their governments to pay attention. I think that will be the most powerful way that we can see politicians start to take action. We've been talking so much about the harmful effects of fossil fuels, and yet emissions are rising. It took a conflict to realize that actually it was smarter to switch to renewables if we had done that many years ago. But look at what young people around the world are doing. They are taking Shell to court. Even in my own country, they're taking the government to court on land use and so forth. If our commission can ignite that understanding, the evidence that it generates makes people furious, but also empowered to do something, then we might see country to country, village to village, region to region, and hopefully globally, things will start to move.
Jemilah, Kathryn, thank you so much. I think the work you're doing is amazing, and I can't wait to read all the recommendations from the Commission.
Thank you, Salma. Lovely to be here.
This episode was edited by Catalina Melendez-Contreras, with marketing and outreach by Kinkini Bahaduri. The podcast is supported by the School of Public Health and the Frick Initiative at Washington University in St. Louis. You can find Complicating the Narrative wherever you get your podcast, and you can also watch the episodes on YouTube. If you found this conversation useful, rating, sharing, or recommending the podcast is one of the best ways to help us reach more people. Thank you for listening.